Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Mist Podcast. This is your boy, Arrow Mist. Today, I'm going to talk about regular DMT. Last episode, we talked about 5-MeO DMT, the toad venom. I'm going to talk about regular DMT this time, and exactly my experience, my take. Always, before you induce any substance, no matter what it is, underneath any parameter, educate yourself on the substance, how to do it correctly, how to not waste any of it, how to not, how to get the experience if that's what you're searching for, how to be safe about it, and hopefully some detail about my experience also gives you an idea on like what you might be experiencing if you've never experienced it, and if so, then just overall the creative-esque of my personal experience. Now, I, in my experience, have never been much of a visual person overall, right? Like, my experience as a human has been much more auditorily inclined than it has been visually inclined. Hence why my first everything with my existence is always like my ears, and everything to do with my ears or my voice. But my eyes, not exactly the same way. So when it came to a substance that basically completely transforms your visual premise and gives you the visual experience, that's probably something that made me slightly fearful and afraid of this substance in general, was like the complete disconnect of being no longer here at all, and like under a whole type of like intense, and because we obviously measure you doing things, and people talk about entering the gate and like breaking the gate and whatever it is, and I think that this is just, it's an intensity threshold, more or less, to talk about. And when breaking that intensity threshold is whenever you start getting into these very extreme and vast experiences, and it's because they completely break the frame mold of like, I would say it's, I was experiencing, as you would say, the general thing when you take it. I never really had, I almost was so scared of the breakthrough, I didn't really have much of a breakthrough experience. A lot of it was like observing and experiencing the gate. And the gate, as you could say, is basically, in my interpretation, to put this more correctly, would be a lot of it is just fractal geometry, and it is almost like you're looking at just like this imperial mode of fractalization. Once again, if you go into YouTube, you type in fractals, you can go see what those look like if you do not know what they look like, and it's immaculate. But seeing them underneath DMT, which is basically where like you close your eyes and like everything that's in your visual periphery ends up basically just becoming this colorful geometric fucking world, and the reference of like your experience to anything that seems not out, or anything outside of that substance, the difference is another level of night and day. But obviously, when you are experiencing this visually, I think we have, and this will probably go into a different episode where I talk about like the human concept of death and how we perceive it and what it actually, from a spiritual point, is and what it is not. Hold on, I gotta put that in my notes because I'm actually gonna have to go over that one. I'll know what I'm talking about by putting that down. All right, but when you're taking a visual substance into a person that is not very visually inclined, it basically is like showing me a world that I don't even know exists. Showing me a world that I have never been able to experience that vividly. And there are some people that walk this planet that see that type of geometry every single day of their life, and it seems normal to them, and they, you know what I mean? And there are some people that are so like, just whatever. There's a vast amount of human beings, but I am just one of them that when you're going to give me something that makes me experience what I've never been able to even remotely comprehend, is like, whew, and it almost feels like dying in itself to go experience and rebirth a whole new experience, to then come out of it and coming out of it being like dying and then just coming back here and being reborn again in a really odd, intricate way. Because every time I took any of these substances psychedelically, they always had a very beautiful impact on my experience and my evolution as a human being, as a conscious entity of any sort, just kind of sitting here throughout my experience. So with regular DMT, I recommend watching the episode about 5-MeO because I had a much more intricate emphatic experience with 5-MeO DMT. But being able to experience something that is non-local to you but is still almost just as valid and just as real is not only extremely terrifying, but beautiful in the sense that we're even capable of doing that. Like, it just kind of goes to show you that, like, all of these substances are opening some form of gate for you to experience the true expansive form of what consciousness even actually is. Like, everything that we think we understand is just such a small fraction of what it, or the whole of the truth, is. And that's kind of the whole point of talking about these things, is to give my point of interpretation to how I've perceived some of these experiences. And like regular DMT, I say regular dimethyltryptamine, as in the the one that doesn't come from the toad venom, but the one that is naturally usually found and how people make it. I know there's different types of DMT too. Like, I'm not the most educated per se on all the technicality part of this here, but I do understand more, obviously, my case and what I am in is the spiritual understanding side of the whole thing. And that's where we take this into account now. I think I tried really hard to break through at one of those points. And it in itself, I also was putting it in blunts occasionally. And the way that it would change the scope of the experience, opening my eyes. It was interesting how a lot of times when I was taking that substance, I wanted to keep my eyes open, almost as if like this reality from a visual point itself was already so foreign to me, which was very ironic when I think about it. But like most people, when you do these things, you would figure that you close your eyes and like you're fucking whoa. But when I microdosed regular DMT, it just wasn't the same. And it was like, but I feel like I was still getting something out of the substance, essentially, right? Because anytime that you take it, we talk about dimethyltryptamine and DMT in these ways where people have these mind-blowing experiences. And it's like, well, let's spiritually understand what the substance is capable of outside of you doing a hit of it that makes you extremely fucking high. Because that's not really the point. The point of these substances is not to be high. It is to be able to experience. Period. But I'd say experience, comma, also being able to grab new facets of information from the energy field, which we comprehendively know exists. Obviously, that you can just pull information from a higher dimensional place and use your subconscious or your consciousness in general as like a dry eraser wall, essentially, of putting all these things together point to point. Some people more embedded with doing that than others, but the point is that when you take a substance like this that is opening the gate for you to expand your experience elsewhere, is almost just like there's still so much information you're downloading, you're getting something, understanding something you didn't before. And that's why I think it's so imperative that we know what these things can do in microdoses, because I felt like what that was doing was making me touch base with my reality in a way at a microdose level that I've never experienced, still to this day, even with psilocybin. And it's interesting to know how delicately different the different intensity levels, and how like, and I'm gonna probably have a very detailed description at some point where we go over the intensity level differences in how these substances change, enhance, or fluctuate your senses. And on top of that fluctuation, why it can seem so sporadic, because there's so many factors that go into any substance giving you certain types of experiences that are literally from physical, quote, physical, local things to non-local spiritual aspects. And so there's a lot to understand. But I have more understanding with psilocybin than I do with how that works. Not so much DMT, because DMT itself, just haven't done a lot of it. And incorporating it as a microdose would definitely take a lot more observation and experimentation. If anybody has any more information on this, please drop in the comments, DM me. I would love to know more about other people's experience with dimethyltryptamine as a microdose. Although the higher doses are beautiful with all of these different substances, and especially dimethyltryptamine too, you always have to remember that there's still so much there to be taken. There are lessons to be had. There is something, you're having the experience for a reason, even if it is not of this world. And if we do not remember that we are still the students of the universe at every given point when we experience these accelerative enhancing substances that are just having so much go on in our experience, that we still have to gather what we're given. Otherwise, like, that's why some people, and maybe that's even why on my own 5-MeO DMT trip that I'm still sitting here like, whoa, bro, what the fuck? And it makes me like not want to try it again, as if like I'm fiending for it, but like that there was something there that I just could not comprehend, that I feel deeply that I need to comprehend. Like, not that I just want, but it's something that like I feel there's a comprehension there that I don't have, or like was sparked from that experience to get there, but I didn't fully grasp it, if that makes sense. And it was interesting. But when you transfer this to how regular DMT works, and maybe that's kind of why it's like there's so many different substances with dimethyltryptamine anyway, in different ways that it exists, then all of those are obviously having different temporal effects to the brain. And so we have to just kind of take into account, like, there's a reason why a substance is going to affect me a little bit differently, or give me a specific type of experience that I'm more familiar with or more comfortable with than how somebody else would be. And so when looking at these substances, that's why there's some people that fucking probably love regular DMT, and if they've tried 5-MeO, have maybe the opposite experience, or, you know, it's because it's just not the same. So always important to remember to do your research on everything you plan to induce. Go listen to people's stories, but don't take, like, a lot of people experience stuff and they only bring it back to let you understand things from like telling it like a movie or something crazy. But it's like, that's them trying to interpret an experience that has so much dialed information that unless you are capable of articulating it without any type of humanistic bias, is almost impossible to bring to the forefront for someone else to understand. Because saying that you saw this motion of being in a satanic layer or just whatever else, I don't really care to emphasize some type of movie scene, but there's some people that have obviously retold some very extreme stories. And I think that what's important to remember is that you look for like the basic foundations, how geometry fluctuates, how the fluctuation effect on your senses is impaired to experience something completely different, and how at the same time at a microdose level things might be more productive than they would be at a higher dose level. And I think that's just kind of like a coherency with how the brain works to some degree, but everyone's brain works differently at different spiritual levels, different energetic levels, different wirings. Like, we're all wired just slightly different than the other, even though we have the base point of like chemical reactions and other things that are there. So it's just important to walk into this substance specifically having a grasp on knowing it's okay to do a little bit, to try it, to get your toes in the water before you fully just fall into it and you're like, yeah, bro, let's take a whole hit and I'm in. Because both the micro and the macro dose have completely different experiences, and it doesn't take a lot out of the DMT to get you where you need to be. So I would say experiment and remember that your existence is an experiment, right? Like food, anything in general that you put in your body, understand it, experiment with it, know what's good for you, what's not, like what's really good for you and what's really not good for you. And when it comes to a substance in general, I always had to remember, even though I was slightly afraid of it, was that like it's not gonna kill me. No matter what happens, I'm gonna come back here. It's just what I'm going to feel or experience is gonna be so far off from what anyone will ever be able to tell you with words. Words only get so far to describe a visual experience, and it is, from my personal opinion, I still think that there is something deeper to understand with 5-MeO, even at a microdose level, than there might be regular based dimethyltryptamine. So I say regular. I need to get this. I need to get the specifics of this exactly and know like what's going on. But see, I understand the spiritual representation more than I understand some of the science with this, so bear with me. But once again, that's why I tell you, do your research. I'm just here to offer somewhat of a guidance and to give a very vague, generalized understanding and idea of like what's going on and how I've experienced it, which my experience really isn't that deep. Because honestly, the bigger points were the after effects of like the clarity of mind and the euphoricism. And by euphoricism, like the way you would describe that is like being in awe, where you're just like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, not shock, but basically shock is a negative connotative thing. So instead of that, the opposite in a positive connotation, where you just, almost as if something was so beautiful and so immaculate that you were just like stuck with your jaw dropped, just like, oh my gosh, why? And not necessarily fully like that, because there's some instances on psilocybin where it kind of takes you a little deeper, but nonetheless, it was much more intricate and interesting to experience as a microdose than it was as a macrodose, in my personal opinion. Now, I know some people talk about saying that the closest they've ever been to feeling death is going to be DMT. But I feel like I have a better understanding of that experience from a very high psilocybin dose, and that's why when I look at some of these substances, to me they feel like repurposed and repackaged things that basically just have effects in different ways. It's like, here's something that does something, put it in the gear. Here's something that doesn't fit in that gear, so it works a little bit differently, but it hits all these other receptors, and it's almost like you know what I mean, if that makes any sense. It's like every single one fits differently into your clockwork, but almost kind of works around in the same connotative way. It's interesting. But nonetheless, whenever you're doing these types of substances, do your research, be safe. Don't waste any. Because that happens too. Just because stuff is not cheap out there. It is what it is. I know what world we're living in, but really evaluate your experience too. Because if there's something to comprehend from something and it's going to put it in front of you, then there's, once again, obviously going to be a reason. There's a very direct reason why you're having the experience. And just remember to take your lessons, reflect, and keep a note of them, at least for yourself. You don't have to for anyone else, really, or put them out here like I am. But, your experience is still a part of your own personal growth. And that's what all of these substances are trying to accommodate us for, one way or another. And there's just different realms of our own existence that we're always existing in, but these different levels of intensity take us into to experience specific things in specific ways. And so when they affect different senses, they're giving you a specific type of like lens to to look through with this experience, and it's interesting, and it's worth exploring. But I will say, don't get lost in chasing an experience that is your eternity, because everything you experience will always be your infinite eternity. But don't, and I know this because there was a buddy of mine who was doing it for a while, and I haven't talked to him in a while, but he would just do it a lot, and I never really understood, like, if there was just something there he was chasing, or if there was like some concept he was trying to grasp. And I think it's important to remember that, like, you can use anything to not do the best of things for yourself. So make sure your intentions are pretty clear when you're taking something. Intentions are so important. So, and this also helps you on your reflection and paying attention. So thank you so much for listening. Do your research. I will see you in the next one. Aramis.xyz.